Okay. All right. Hey guys, I am Null Sleep from 8-Bit Peoples. I'm going to be talking today about chip music and chip tunes. Um, the name of the talk is Square Wave to Heaven. I can't take credit for any cleverness in that, though. It's actually suggested by a friend of mine from Chicago who goes by the name Sasquatch, who also does some chip music stuff. So let's get started. And first question, what is chip music? I think the best description I've seen for it that sums it up nicely and in a short amount of space is music composed by using, emulating, or sampling digital sound chips. And a Swedish C64 musician that goes by Go280 is the one who said this. So what does that mean? Basically, it means that you are either using old machines and directly using their sound chips as synthesizers, or you are sampling small bits of waveforms, so one frame of a square wave, one frame of a triangle wave, something like that, and using that as a looped sample in your tune. Or, you know, in some cases now, people are just sampling old video game sounds and incorporating them with other types of electronic music genres. Where the line is drawn in what is chip music and what isn't totally clear. Different people have different feelings. But what ties it all together is the distinctive sound set that you're working within. There's also a unique attitude that's held by a lot of the participants in the community, and that is that the chip music is often very non-commercial in nature. There have been commercial releases on vinyl, on CD, and so on, but for the most part, it's music that is released for free through the web or at parties, and the releases, if they are released sometimes on CD, are also very often very cheap do-it-yourself releases, CDR labels and things like that. This doesn't mean that chip musicians aren't serious about what they're doing. A lot of the times they're very serious about it, but because of the roots of the genre, well, maybe not a genre, but we'll get into that later, because of the roots of chip music, there is a very deep-running attitude about making things free or making things open to everyone. The tools to make chip tunes or chip music are also usually free or cheap, relatively speaking, in terms of, in comparison to other types of electronic music. A lot of the times the software will be released for free. And if there's hardware that's necessary, it will also, obviously you can't release hardware for free, but people will provide you with schematics for how to build it yourself and things like that. I think the general attitude is about openness and sharing of knowledge in the chiptune scene, and there's less ego involved in the community than with other forms of music. So you have more of a sense of camaraderie with everyone else that's involved. And just to clarify something that is a very common misconception, probably not among people in this room, but in the general public, chip music is not about remixing video game music at all. So when you go to a chiptune show, the worst thing you can possibly do is scream out something like, "Play Tetris," or "Play Contra." And I can't tell you how many times I've heard stuff like that. And at first, I would brush it off, but now if you scream that, I'll fucking rip your head off. All right, so let's see. Did you go to the next one? All right. Areas of focus. So 40-minute talk, I can't cover everything in the chip music scene. I'm going to sort of go with my personal bias and try and limit things to hardware-specific chiptunes, for example, SIDs, NSFs, things like that, and sample-based track chiptunes such as mods, IT, XM, Screen Tracker modules, etc. There's obviously a lot more out there than what I'm going to talk about today. So, chip music as a false genre. This is what I was hinting at a little bit before, and the question is chip music a genre? And I would say the answer is probably no. The basis of categorization is for people calling chip music or chiptunes a genre is that they all use the same sound set. Those sort of lo-fi, square waves and bleepy tones. But if you're going to use that as the basis of categorization for a genre, then you might as well lump rock, blues, and metal together and call it guitar music. I mean, it's the equivalent. So referring to the genre, referring to chip music as a genre is really misleading because you have an extremely wide range of styles within the chip music scene. So you have to keep that in mind when you listen to a chiptune and you say, or if you listen to a handful of them and you say, I don't like chip music, it sucks. You might have only heard one style of chip music, and you might hear something else that is completely different and appeals to you. So we have a growing scene and I think increasing visibility over the past few years, and there may come changes with that. As the scene grows, people might become more knowledgeable about the differences within it, and you might see different genres actually emerging within chip music. In fact, there's a guy, has anyone here heard of a band, German band, Bodenständig 2000? So Dragan Espenshade from Bodenständig actually was working on trying to come up with different names for all the genres within the chip music scene a while ago, and I don't think he ever finished this or released it, but I managed to get my hands on a copy of some of the notes he was taking. So I'm just going to read off a couple of these, and I think they're pretty clever. So one of them is Jump and Run, Super Mario, Sonic style, incorporated sound effects for jumping or collecting coins and rings. So you have your basic, you can have just a basic electronic music track and then throw in those little sort of cliche sound effects, and you suddenly have a chip music jump and run track. Geekcore, spelled G33KC0RE. Hardcore rave and chip metal, classic rave arrangements, heavy basses, GABA shouting, extreme arpeggio. This is one of my favorite definitions for a chip music genre. Extreme arpeggio, very French style, developed by the Paris Micromusic HQ. Arpeggios as a very distinctive technique of chip music to create the illusion of several tone harmonies on a single tone channel are applied to the complete song. Very hardcore. So arpeggios are often used in chip music, but these guys in Paris have a tendency to really fucking use arpeggios a lot. Sega Metal. Anyone who's played a lot of Genesis or Mega Drive games, I'm sure knows this style. What are some other good ones? Pro Tracker Italo, one of my favorite chip music genres, actually. Emotronic, Agro Cute, which is reference to high-frequency, fast square wave melodies that are not balanced by lower or middle frequencies in the arrangement. Usually octave bass lines originate in piezo beepers for handheld games or Tamagotchis that can only play one note at a time. Gets on many people's nerves, others cannot live without it. And it goes on, but basically you get the idea. There's a wide range of styles within the chip music scene. So to classify chip music as a genre itself is a bit misleading for most people. Okay, so moving on to the origins of chip music. I'm sure a lot of you are probably somewhat familiar with this, so just going to talk a little bit about it. I think, and this is also open to debate, everything in this talk is basically personal opinion, and there's some wiggle room here and there. I may be wrong about things, or you may disagree, but the way I see it, there are two main routes to chip music, and that's video game music. So soundtracks of early arcade games or console games, where you basically were limited in the number of channels you could use, and there was no samples that you could use. And of course, the demo scene, where you had productions that were being made with graphics, and of course, at first you were just adding your graphics to the beginning of games you cracked and released, and then as those crack throws became more and more elaborate, you wanted to add music and show off a little bit more, so that's where the chiptune music came in. And a lot of the times the early ones were just ripping music from games and would use that as the soundtrack, but then people started wanting to write their own music. So what's the underlying theme that both of them share? It's about overcoming the limitations that you're working within and doing the most that you can with the little you have to work with. The hardware was slow. You were only offered maybe between 3 and 5 channels to work with. So when you only have three channels to work with, you need to cram as much as you can into those 3 channels, and you need to use all the tricks that you can think of in order to trick the listener into hearing more than 3 channels. How was chip music made in the beginning? So when video games, when C64 games were just starting, obviously, your own Tell didn't pull out, a tracker from the company he was hired from and write the music for the game. He had to code the sound engine himself. He had to figure out how to make that sound engine optimized enough so that it could actually run with the graphics of the game and the game logic running along with it. And that's a lot to ask of a C64. So the early chip music was made basically by hand coding assembly or machine language. Fortunately, you don't have to do that anymore. There are tools that have become available recently, in around the mid-'80s. In 1986, I believe it was, a guy by the name of Carson Obarski released Sound Tracker, which was the first Amiga tracker, or I think the first tracker in general, the first Amiga tracker. And he created the mod file format, which I'm sure pretty much everyone in the room is aware of. Soon after that, it was disassembled, and this was probably one of the most important events in the chip music scene. The fact that this program had been disassembled, because now people started taking that source code and creating their own trackers. So this led to a proliferation of trackers, which in a lot of cases improved upon Obarski's Sound Tracker. So one of the most important was Pro Tracker for the Amiga. In a few years later, in 1989, you have a guy by the name of Matt Simmons, aka Format, who decided it would be cool to use only very small looped samples in his Amiga mod. So we're talking 1 frame of a square wave, 1 frame of of white noise, and just use these very short looped samples in order to get a mod file that was extremely small, but also resulted in a specific sound that was more reminiscent of C64 music than what people were doing with Amiga music, because once the Amiga trackers appeared, you had the ability to use sampled channels. So you could write, techno on the Amiga, you could write Gabber on the Amiga, and there were people doing this. It was like, for some people, it was being stuck in the C64 with its 3 channels and, limited waveforms, and then being given the opportunity to use sampled sounds was, a huge gift for them. And they embraced that and their music started evolving. But for others, there was something about those old sounds that they really liked and latched onto. And that's when you see that there was a technological rift developing in the scene. So technology progresses, chip music is no longer a necessity. Yeah, you guys are probably reading ahead. I can't cover that last one yet. So with the progress of technology, obviously you can't slow things down. You have to just roll with it. Music in video games was no longer limited to a few channels. You had full orchestral soundtracks developing for games. When video game consoles decided to move from cartridges to CDs, that fucking sucked, okay, in my opinion. Because then you started having people game companies basically just grabbing the hottest techno producers and saying, okay, let's use their tracks for this game. So you lost a lot of the character that was tied to video game music, and it basically became more like movie soundtracks. Whether that's a good or a bad thing, I guess it depends on the game. Final Fantasy, okay, maybe the orchestral soundtrack works better, but I still say, like, my favorite Final Fantasy is, like, on the Super Nintendo, which was, it wasn't quite chiptune, but it was still sort of that characteristic video game sound. So once you have this progress of technology and computers becoming better, and the transition to the PC from Commodores, Amigas, and Ataris, where on those platforms your hardware was basically the same, no matter who you were. If you had an Amiga, you had this hardware to a more or less degree, and if you had a C64, you had this hardware. That constant was very important in the early demo scene because it basically tied you to the limitations of that platform, and you had to do the most you could with those limitations. But once you get the PC and its expandable options, not everyone has the exact same setup, and you're what am I trying to say? The transition went from doing the most with the hardware you have and breaking the limitations to more of an emphasis on design. So that's when demos sort of changed from showing off how many polygons you could get on the screen or something like that, to how cool can I make this fly-through look. And I think that for me, the demos lost a lot of their appeal at that point because I was most interested in seeing those technological limitations being broken and seeing people brag about, oh, look at how many metaballs I have on screen right now and things like that. And the demos now, sure, there are beautiful ones, but it doesn't have the same essence to it. And the same with chip music and demos now. Obviously, a lot of demos now don't use chip music. But you did have those people that decided to stay behind and continue working on the old platforms and continue to do new things with them and still try and push the limitations. Also, age of personal computer begins, fuck you, PC, fuck you. So that's how I feel about it. I like the idea of having a piece of hardware that's immutable, and you have to do the most you can with it. And there are still people doing new things on the C64, so, you know, why did we leave it behind? And this is where I cry. But chip music survived anyway, because of those people, I guess, like me, who decide to hold on to the past as a conscious choice. And there are others that decided to bring the sounds from yesterday to the platforms of today. So these are the people that released chip music discs on the PC, groups like Rebels and Beep Dealers, and I don't know if any of you are familiar with Megahawks. Okay, I'm glad there are some Megahawks fans because they're fucking awesome. And I'm gonna just take a brief break, and I'm gonna play some of these. Let me get out of here. I'm gonna play some PC chip music disc examples. So here's the first chip music disc from Rebels. So what you have is a self-contained player, and packed along with it are a bunch of modules that various members of Rebels track. So you have this still distinctive sound from the old platforms, but on the PC, and yeah, it's amazing. The whole thing is like under 300K. So things like this. Let's go to their second music disc also. So you hear that they were sticking with those old sounds, and they were making a conscious decision that we don't really want to use samples in our songs. We don't want to use high quality samples in our songs. We want to stay with those short loop samples and emulate the sounds that we were hearing, you know, as we grew up going through the demo scene and making chip music. And then let's see, this is a more recent example is Beep Dealers. This is a Swedish music group who unfortunately never, they were supposed to release a second disc, and it still hasn't been released, but maybe one day we'll see it. But this was a really promising first music disc. And in the center you'll see this is actually an animation that was recorded on a Game Boy camera. So even the graphics are sort of tied to that low-res aesthetic. And this is a track by Zabutom, who's in my opinion one of the best PC trackers around, probably. All right, and last but not least, we're gonna go and let's see if I can get the Megahawks one up here. I'm gonna have to switch to one monitor. Hold on one second. I'm disabling a second monitor just for this music disc. That's how good it is. Now let's see if I can get it to go to that. I might not be able to get it on the screen, but all right. Let me just play one of these tracks for you guys. All right, now I just screwed up the whole monitor setup. All right, 1 second. Sorry, some technical difficulties. All right. Megahawks do not want to play. Let's see. All right, I'm gonna try and play one of the mods, my favorite one from this music disc. And you're right, it wouldn't happen with a Commodore because of this fucking PC. So let me see if I can play one of these in XM Play instead. Fuck you. All right. Yeah, let's go. All right. Can we get a little more volume? So this is a PC music disc release, and when you hear this is totally fucking awesome. Like, I mean, if the people that know what I'm feeling right now know what I'm feeling, and the people that don't, there's no way I could explain anyway. So, fucking Megahawks, that's all I have to say. Alright, so let's get back to the boring fucking talk. Oh shit, now I screwed up, I forgot I screwed up the monitors. Let's see if I can get it working again. Yes, okay. Okay. So yeah. So you had the PC chip music discs who were sort of bridging the gap between the people that wanted to stay behind and work on the old platforms and the people that decided, okay, let's move on. So there was that nice medium to them. And then around 1999, I think you had what was basically a new era of chip music emerging. And this was due to a couple new communities that sort of started up around the turn of the century. And I think one of the most important ones was a site called micromusic.net, which in a lot of ways is not strict chip music at all, but it did have a lot of people that were in the chip music scene sort of were attracted to it because it had a very lo-fi aesthetic to it. It was basically a site where people could upload their music, and then every month or so, a batch of those songs that were uploaded were selected to be put on the site and available for download. And they had a lot of nice things going for them because they had basically a system where when you were signed into the site, you could see who else was signed in and you can send messages to them. So what this did was it helped sort of introduce a lot of people that weren't familiar with the chip music scene to the scene, and it also helped them communicate with other people. So when you had that small group of people that were involved in the scene talking to the new guys, it was a nice way of educating them about the history of what had come before, and that this site micromusic.net wasn't the beginning of it, but it was just a punctuation of a new era, I think, in chip music. And at the same time, also in 1999 in November, I started a group called 8-Bit Peoples along with my friend Mike Hanlon from Detroit. And 8-Bit Peoples was basically, in the way we originally envisioned it, a collective of musicians and or artists who were interested in sort of pursuing the lo-fi aesthetic, both in music and art. The first things that I was releasing through 8-Bit Peoples were were a lot less chip music than what I release now. So my definition sort of changed, and my interests have sort of shifted, and I've become a little bit more of a purist and maybe a little bit more of an elitist, although I try to keep an open mind. But yeah, 8-Bit Peoples has been going for, I guess, 8 years now, and we've focused on music through a lot of our history, and we've also been involved with releasing art packs and things like that. So along with micro music, I think we did a lot to sort of shape this new era of chip music. And what we shaped it into, I'm not sure if it's good or bad, but it was unavoidable, I think. So another thing that happened around this time was the rise of the Nintendo scene, or I prefer my Square Waves unfiltered, thanks, because on the C64 you had filters which gave it a really distinct sound, and of course the NES and the Game Boy don't have filters, and you also have a very distinct Nintendo sound. It's immediately obvious to anyone who knows a little bit about chip music when they hear a Nintendo song and when they hear a Commodore song. So this rise of the Nintendo scene was due to a couple different things. Two programs called LSDJ and Nanoloop were released, and this made Game Boy chiptunes possible. And this was also really important because of the platform choice. The Game Boy is such a ubiquitous piece of hardware. So many people have Game Boys, and not only in one area where in Europe, for example, you had a lot of people with C64s. In the US, not so many people had C64s. In Japan, not so many people had C64s. There was that sort of geographical disparity between them. But with the Game Boy, everyone fucking had a Game Boy. You had people in Europe, of course, had Game Boys. People in Japan, of course, had Game Boys. People in the US had Game Boys. So this was a platform that was ubiquitous enough across the entire globe that it brought together a global community of people that were interested in now making music using the Game Boy. And then in December of 2001, something called MCK was released by a couple of Japanese guys. And MCK is basically an application and a sound driver for writing NES music or Famicom music. And this kickstarted the NES Famicom chip music scene. There were previous options. One of them was called Nerd Tracker 2, which was released by a Swedish guy going by Bananmos. He actually released Nerd Tracker 2, which was a tracker to write NES music, at a demo party in entering it into a competition for the most useless piece of software. So that tells you a little bit maybe about the feelings at that time to chiptunes in that particular demo party. But obviously there were people that were interested in writing NES music, and to them, Nerd Tracker 2 was a good option, although it has its shortcomings. For instance, the reason why MCK's release in 2001 was so important was Nerd Tracker 2 didn't even allow things like copy and paste. So it was pretty annoying to work with. And then MCK came along, and it offers up its own set of annoyances in that it's actually not a tracker. It's an application that you have to write your song in music macro language, so you're basically typing into a text file and then converting it with MCK into assembly language and then compiling the assembly into an NSF file. But it allowed copy and paste because you can copy and paste in a text file. It was also important because it was released by some of these Japanese guys, like I said, and that sort of helped to bridge the gap between Japan's chip music scene and the Western chip music scene, and that was something that was, for a long time, very separate. You had, in Japan, they were coming from that video game music origin that I talked about, and in the West, we were coming from more of the demo scene origins. So bringing them together was something that was really basically a pretty big event for the chip music scene. Around that time also, and mostly probably because of micromusic.net, a lot of these chip music artists decided that they were going to start taking to the stage and playing live gigs, and this started happening a lot in Europe. And then around the same time in the US, I had my first gig in 2001 in New York, and I played Game Boy on stage. And I think there were maybe 10 people in the audience. But it was sort of, looking back on it, it was a really cool experience. And one of the people in the audience, I don't know if any of you know of him, his name's Corey Archangel. So that was sort of cool because Corey Archangel is an artist, and he's sort of a darling of the art scene in New York, who has put a lot of focus on hacking NES cartridges and things like that. So it sort of felt like, one of those early punk gigs maybe where there are famous people in the audience, even though there's only a few of them. And then you also had, speaking of punk, in 2003, a Wired article came out written by Malcolm McLaren, who was the manager of the Sex Pistols, and he basically pronounced chip music the new 8-bit punk, and he more or less claimed that he discovered the chip music scene, but he phrased it in a way that not like, oh, there's this cool chip music scene and I discovered it, as in I came across it, but more like, I discovered this chip music scene and I'm presenting it up to all of you. So a lot of people within the scene didn't really take kindly to that. So there was a bit of a backlash against him, but some of the things he was referring to as punk maybe make sense, maybe don't. He was calling chip music the new punk because a lot of it had a DIY aesthetic. The tools were cheap, the sounds were cheap, things were dirty, and there was a less serious attitude in terms of not really, a lot of the artists weren't really interested in pursuing commercial goals with their music. They were just interested in doing it for the fun of it and to see what they could do with it. But in general, I think the chiptune scene rejected Malcolm McLaren's involvement. But we do probably have him to thank for an increased visibility. Well, him to thank or blame, depending on your perspective. And the rejection of him, though, as someone, as an outsider to the scene, really showed that there's a strong community present, sense of community present within the scene, and we sort of don't really appreciate people that we see as cultural vampires trying to come into the scene and latch onto it and make it their own. On the other hand, if you're someone that has a genuine interest in it and you want to learn more about it, and you come in with a sense of knowledge seeking, then there are going to be a lot of people that will be happy to help you. So, moving on. Now, trackers, tools, and tricks. So what are the trackers now that people are using? Obviously, we don't have to write in assembly language anymore. We don't have to write our own sound engines. Some of these are what I would say are probably, these are in my opinion the seminal pieces of software for their respective platforms. So on the Commodore 64, you have JCH Editor by Jens Christian Huss, I believe you pronounce it, and this is something that Commodore 64 chiptune musicians like Go280 use, and it's one of the most powerful pieces of software for composing music on the Commodore 64. On the Amiga, you have ProTracker, which is a sample-based tracker, and saves to mod file format, as you know. And you also have something called AHX Tracker, which I just want to say a few words about. This is basically a Pro Tracker-like music editor that was designed to create C64-like synthetic tunes. So this is another example of those. This is even an earlier example of, you had the people that, you know, when they made the move to PC, they wanted to hold on to those old sounds, so they released the PC chip music discs. But then you had people that even when they moved to Amiga, they still wanted to hold on to those old sounds. So this group released Abyss Highest Experience, is what AHX stands for, and it was designed to actually, create C64-like tunes on the Amiga. There's no support for sampled instruments, and you have basically an average AHX tune is about 200 bytes, or up to 5 kilobytes. All the waveforms of the C64 are supported on a triangle, sawtooth, square, and white noise. So this was a tracker that was pretty unique on the Amiga. On Atari ST, you have Music Mon 2, which has been used by a lot of the YM rockers, and a lot of, I think also used by Bodenständig 2000. On the Game Boy, you have LSDJ and Nanoloop, which I've mentioned. LSDJ is is a 4-channel tracker. Nanoloop is sort of, it's an interesting program. It's not really a tracker at all. Its interface is based on a 4x4 matrix of squares that you basically drop things down into. And yeah, it's not my style of music making, but it's something that a lot of people have done really interesting things with. Carillon Tracker, or Carillon Editor, is a tracker for the Game Boy that's specifically geared towards making Game Boy music for demos, whereas LSDJ is specifically focused on just making Game Boy music. It's actually way too CPU intensive to be used along with a demo, really. On the NES, you have Nerd Tracker 2 and MCK, which I've mentioned. You also have a relatively new tracker called FamiTracker, which is the first, what I'd call the first modern NES tracker. It runs in Windows, whereas Nerd Tracker 2 requires a DOS environment. And progress is still being made on it. The author is still working on it, and it looks really promising. It's also interesting because it actually incorporates elements of MML, which was what you use to program for MCK, within the tracker. So you actually define your volume envelopes and duty cycle envelopes as MML commands. And then there's MIDI-NES, which is a cartridge that you plug into your NES, and you can basically use your NES as a synthesizer module controlled over MIDI. All of these things are basically designed to help you get the most out of your hardware. So the trackers will employ glitches in the software or in the hardware to sort of do things that the designers of the hardware never intended it to do. And then as a tracker yourself, you are also trying to figure out ways to trick people into hearing more than is actually there. So you're doing things like, which we said before, creating arpeggios. So playing through 3 notes super quickly to fake the person into hearing a chord. Very common in chip music. You also are doing things like manually creating echo or delay effects. So within one channel, taking the same melody and not transposing it, moving it down by 2 steps or something like that, and then setting a lower volume level on that second melody copy, so you can get this sort of echo effect, but you don't have any external effects that you're actually using, that you're manually creating it. So I think that's pretty much everything I have to say. I want to play some more music for you, because that's the most fun part, obviously, is actually hearing this stuff. Um, I'll see you after the talk. So let's see. I'm gonna play some Commodore 64 stuff by Go280 first. I'm just gonna give you guys a little taste of each of these because I don't think we have time to go through all of them in full. But this is a song by Go280 called Pop on the Commodore 64. Uh-oh. Is the PC volume up? Okay, here we go. So this is 3 channels on the C64. A lot of pitch bending involved. I remember, so the first time I heard this song was basically when Go280 Anders released it at a demo party, and I was just completely blown away. And then I think it was a few months later, I got a demo CD in the mail for an 8-Bit People's release, and it was from Anders, and this song was one of the songs. So I was, of course, ecstatic. And this song comes from an 8-Bit People's release called Contact, which is by Anders. And then let's just go through a couple more really quickly because I think I only have 5 minutes left. Here's just a little taste of a mod file from Format. If any of you guys were involved in the Amiga scene, you might recognize this one. I'll just skip into it a little bit. So this is definite Amiga style demo scene chip music. And then I'm gonna play a little by Mortimer Twang, who is one of my favorite Amiga musicians. This song is called I'm the Passenger. And you can also hear the range of styles just in 3 so far is pretty immense. Here is an Atari ST tune by Pauza. Flipping around a bit.
My sound system amplifiers. Your my sound system amplifiers.
And here are some Game Boy tunes, first by Bit Shifter. And here's one by Random. Here you hear that simulated echo effect that we're talking about done really well. Very distinctive style for the Game Boy. And then let's play a little bit of Naruto's Artificial Intelligence Found. This is one of probably the best chiptune music composer in Japan. Probably is this guy Naruto, who unfortunately disappeared from the scene a while back, but we're hoping for a comeback. Definitely a distinctly Japanese style of chip music. It's something you can imagine almost like an anime opening theme as. And let's do one more for the NES from Zik, just to show you a difference in approach. Obviously very different from Naruto's track. And last one I'm going to play is a PC mod from Vert. Yes, who sucks because he is not at this party and he is in the US. So I'll kick his ass when I get back to New York. This is from his first FX EP released on Monotonic Net label. So this is done in a sort of Castlevania-ish style, emulating the NES, but actually a PC module. And I'll leave you with just a few places if you wanna check these places out. More chiptunes to be found. High Voltage SID Collection is the first link. The Mod Archive, 8bitpeoples.com, 2A03 Music Archive for NES music. Also has very active forums if you want to get into NES music composition. And probably the most important site, I would say, is fork.org, video game or chiptune news site run by a guy in Japan that goes by Hallie. Probably the most important site for tying together the Japanese and Western chip music scenes. So that's it for me. Thanks a lot, guys. Yes, not all of the hardware had stereo capabilities. NES music is only in mono. For example, Game Boy music, on the other hand, it does have some stereo capabilities. Yeah, if anyone else has any questions, sure.
Is there any more questions? We're running out of time.
Okay. It's because I cursed.